The first black drum major for the Michigan State Spartan marching band was a man by the name of Henry Baltimore Jr. He was living in an off-campus apartment in Oak Hill Apartments in 1973. On March 3rd of that year, two men showed up at Henry's apartment and attacked him. They pistol-whipped him, tied him up, and robbed him. Henry was afraid to report the crime right away, waiting 10 days before going to the police. He had recognized one of his attackers, a 19-year-old man by the name of Roy Davis. Police put together a photo lineup of 6 people, and Henry pointed right at Roy's picture. Roy was quickly arrested, but released on bond. Over the next several weeks, Roy stopped by Henry's apartment multiple times and threatened him. He told Henry that he better not testify against him. Fearful for his safety, Henry skipped the preliminary hearing in early May of 1973, resulting in a $50 fine, equivalent to more than $350 today. Also, a warrant was issued for his arrest. However, on May 24th, Henry appeared at the rescheduled hearing to testify. Just 6 days later, on May 30th, he vanished without a trace.
Did he just run away so he didn't have to testify against Roy? That seems highly unlikely because he hasn't been seen or heard from in over 50 years.
Or was he murdered? That seems to be the more likely scenario. But who killed him? And why? Police have never given us any answers. No one has ever been charged in his disappearance. But there is one suspect who stands out in all of this. We'll tell you more about him. This is Twisted Crimes. Henry Baltimore Jr. was the second child born to Henry Baltimore Sr. and Doris Baltimore. He was their first son. After Henry, the family grew to include 6 more children. Henry was an excellent student with a deep love for music, especially the drums.
His older sister Laurel said in the documentary, "What happened to Henry? They would go downstairs and they would be beating that drum all the time. And I would be, they driving me crazy."
His younger brother Lonnie also shared memories in the documentary, noting that Henry would often learn dance moves from one of their sisters. He said they danced all the time. After Laurel graduated from high school, she headed off to college at Michigan State University. She was thrilled when Henry later decided he would join her there. By his junior year in 1973, Henry was excelling academically, earning a spot on the honor roll while pursuing a double major in music and psychology. He had been a drum major in both junior high and high school, and eventually he made history by becoming the first black drum major at Michigan State University.
Laurel was proud of her younger brother. She said, "To be able to be a drum major at a major university was just wonderful." Lonnie said Henry was an amazing drum major. He was using the dance skills his sister taught him through the years to create a whole new way of drum majoring. He would dance while leading the band in parades or out onto the football field.
Lonnie said they couldn't wait for Henry to come up with new steps. He'd get those steps from my sister. They'd dance all the time. After she'd teach him a new step or something, he'd carry it on to the band. Whatever it is, side step or however it was, and he would coordinate that with his band members. And then everybody liked it. And from then on, you see all the bands all over copying it. It was a pattern that just struck. George Heath was Henry's best friend, and he was white. He said they had known each other since they were 12 years old and had gone to junior high and high school together. He said Henry was always a bright light, a very outgoing personality, a smile on his face at all times. Everybody wanted to be Henry's friend. He was just that type of an easygoing, very happy person. He said during those years, even though the schools were integrated, most blacks sat at certain tables at lunch while whites sat at other tables. Most of the white kids had white friends, while the black kids had black friends. But he said that was not the case with Henry. He said Henry was friends with the jocks, other popular kids, and of course, the members of the band. Basically, he loved everybody, and everybody seemed to love him. George said, "We were having fun. We enjoyed playing music, drums. We enjoyed sports. We enjoyed girls. So what more could two guys want?"
When they graduated, George and Henry both decided to attend Michigan State, so it made perfect sense for the both of them to room together. In 1973, George, Henry, and two other people were living in apartment 3 here at Oak Hill Apartments. Even though Henry was busy with his double major along with being the drum major, he still found time to throw a party at the apartment once in a while. Henry and his roommates would invite people over to smoke weed and drink. One of those people who showed up at some of those parties was a man by the name of Roy Lindsay Davis. Apparently, Roy thought Henry and his roommates were selling drugs out of the apartment, so he figured they had lots of drugs and money stashed there.
On March 3rd of 1973, Henry was alone in apartment 3 when Roy and another man decided to stop by. When Henry opened the door, Roy pulled out a gun. He forced Henry into his bedroom, and the two men tied him to his bed. They demanded money and drugs. Roy pistol whipped him and told him he'd blow his head off if he did not show him where the money and drugs were. George said, "We just had our own personal stash like everybody at the time." I think he was mad and frustrated. So that's when all of a sudden he saw my golf bag, saw a leather coat, saw some sweaters, and grabbed those. They also found $110 in cash, which they took as well. After the robbery, Henry was scared. George said Henry was real quiet in the days after the robbery and was keeping to himself, which was not like him at all. Normally, he was the life of the party, but he was terrified. More than a week after the robbery, Henry met with his father, who told him he needed to report the crime to the police. So 10 days after he was attacked and robbed, he finally reported it. He identified 22-year-old Roy Davis as one of the men who had attacked him. Roy was arrested and then released on bond. Roy was furious that Henry had given his name to the police. He blamed Henry for the fact he was arrested. He started coming to visit Henry at his apartment. On multiple occasions, he stopped by and threatened him. He told him he better not show up at his preliminary hearing.
Henry was a wreck. He didn't know what to do. Roy was a scary guy, and Henry was afraid for his life. So Roy made a deal with him. He would return all of the stuff he stole from Henry, and even give him back double the amount of money he stole as long as Henry gave, quote, mild testimony about him during the hearing. However, when the day of the hearing arrived in early May, Roy showed up at Henry's apartment again.
George said, "I remember the day that he had the first arraignment. Roy Davis came by, and for a couple of hours he sat with Henry to make sure he didn't go." So Henry skipped the preliminary hearing, and since the state did not have the victim to testify, the charges against Roy were dismissed. However, the state quickly issued a warrant for Henry's arrest, along with the $50 fine for not showing up. They also reissued the charges against Roy. Roy's plan had backfired on both him and Henry.
Henry met with authorities and told them he wanted to drop the charges against Roy, but Ingham County prosecutor Raymond Scadeller basically said too bad. Raymond felt they had a solid case, and he wanted to make sure justice was served. At that point, Henry realized he could not get out of testifying at court, so the next time Roy showed up to threaten him, Henry explained there was nothing he could do. The rescheduled preliminary hearing was set up for Wednesday, May 24th, 1973. Henry showed up at that one and testified.
Shortly after that, Roy showed up at Henry's apartment again. This time, Henry's roommate George was there. George told the Lansing State Journal, "I was in the apartment when Roy came by after the hearing. He said to Henry, 'Hey man, that wasn't mild stuff. You keep that up and you are gonna be in big trouble. I ain't got nothing to lose at this point.'" Memorial Day was the next Monday, May 28th, so Henry headed back home. The whole family was together for a fun-filled holiday weekend. It would be the last time any of them would see Henry. Henry was due back in court on Friday, June 1st, for the arraignment hearing in Roy's case. On Wednesday, May 30th, a police report states that two people who lived in the apartment building, a woman and a man, showed up and found a green car parked in their assigned parking spot behind the building. When they walked into the building, they saw two black men pounding on Henry's door. The men noticed them and asked if they knew where Henry was.
The woman told them that they had just gotten there and had no idea where he was. The couple went into their apartment, stayed for a couple of minutes, then they left. When they got back in the hallway, they noticed the two men were still there pounding on Henry's door. When they got outside, they saw the green car was still parked in their assigned spot. By the time Henry's roommates got home that day, the men were gone.
When dinner time rolled around, George and the other two roommates gathered around the dinner table at the apartment. George said on the What Happened to Henry documentary, "One thing we always did is we tried to eat together, amazingly. And so that evening around 6, when he didn't show up for dinner, we're like, 'Have you seen Henry? Did he talk to you?' And we're like, 'No.' Sometime after that, Henry's sister Laurel started calling the apartment. She had agreed to type up a final exam for Henry. No one was answering the phone, but then eventually, one of the roommates called her and told her he was not there. Her father drove to meet her, and the two of them went to the apartment.
She said all of his stuff was still inside his apartment, including his clothes, wallet, and keys. Plus his car was in the parking lot. There was no sign of a struggle, no sign of forced entry. Nothing seemed out of place at all, except that Henry had vanished.
One of his roommates, Heath, said he took nothing with him. He didn't take any clothes. He didn't even take his toothbrush. He left his car parked outside. Laurel and Henry Sr. left. The next day, when there was still no sign of Henry, they called the police. George said, "The police were like, 'What are you guys worrying about? He's a guy. He's probably shacked up with a woman somewhere. Probably was out on a bender and is just sleeping it off right now.' They're like, 'Come back in like another 24 hours. Let's give him 48 hours to see if he surfaces.' Once the police found out Henry was scared about having to testify against Roy later that week, Laurel said they told her he had probably just run away, so he would not have to testify. George said, 'I think because he was a black man, they didn't really care. And we didn't have any hard evidence. Because again, we couldn't say. Look it, the door was broken in. There was blood on the wall. There was furniture thrown around.'
By June 5th, the East Lansing Police Department had decided something was wrong and that Henry probably hadn't just run away. The department sent a message to the state police which said, "The circumstances surrounding his disappearance are suspicious and foul play is suspected." Then in August, someone with the East Lansing Police was quoted in the Jackson Citizen Patriot, which was actually a paper Henry used to deliver newspapers for, as saying the investigation had completely run out of clues and information. That seems like a ridiculous statement to make. Less than 3 months after Henry went missing, we would later find out that they had not really investigated Roy at all, and that they had not gone to Flint, where he lived, to talk to people who knew him. So it seems it's not so much as they had run out of clues and information, so much as they had simply given up on the case before they even really got started. After that, since the only witness to Roy's alleged crime was missing, George said the prosecution kept postponing Roy's trial date. Eventually, they decided to move forward with the trial without their lone witness.
Roy said the fact Henry was missing was actually hurting his case. In November of 1973, he told the Lansing State Journal, "I wish he would show up. The whole thing is really hurting me. You just have to know the judge is going to take all this stuff about me being responsible into consideration. I'd be even happier than his parents if he turned up tomorrow." He also said he and Henry had worked out their differences and were friends when Henry went missing. He said, "I knew what I did was wrong, and when I gave him his stuff back, he agreed to drop the charges. Well, by that time, it was out of his hands. There was nothing more that he could do. And I wasn't angry at him. Heck, we even played cards together a week or so after he testified. He didn't seem afraid of anything. If there's been any foul play, it sure doesn't involve me." Eventually, Roy pleaded guilty to armed robbery, and he was sentenced to 6 months in jail, which, according to current Ingham County Sheriff Scott Rigglesworth, probably would have been the exact sentence Roy would have gotten anyway, even if Henry would have still been around to testify. After that, the case went cold for several decades. Sheriff Rigglesworth was a police officer for the East Lansing Police Department for more than 20 years. He said that, despite the fact his dad was the Ingham County Sheriff, he had never heard of the case during his first 20 years as a police officer. In 2014, he started looking into the case, and he was able to find the couple who had seen the men pounding on Henry's apartment door that day. The couple had gotten married at some point and were still together. When Scott went to meet with them, though, they claimed they did not remember anything about that day. He said they did not even remember that Henry had vanished, which to us does seem a bit strange, that this is something anyone, much less both of these witnesses, could have just forgotten about over the years. In 2016, when Scott's dad Gene retired as sheriff, Scott ran and was elected sheriff of Ingham County, getting 58% of the vote. At some point after he became sheriff, he sat down and did an interview for the documentary. During the interview, he stated that he was certain someone knows what happened to Henry, and he understood why they might not have wanted to come forward with that information at the time. He said, probably multiple people know what happened to Henry, and there were clearly people back when this was happening, back in the early 70s, that were scared to death to come forward. Because what did Henry do? He came forward. He testified and got killed, right? He said it was very hard to go back in time to try to solve this case because of the lack of effort from the original investigators. He said the report itself, when it was taken initially, both the armed robbery report and the missing persons report were pretty basic. The original armed robbery, there was really no evidence taken, no pictures taken. And then, when he went missing, there's no evidence associated with that case at all. Henry Baltimore Sr. died in 1990. Then, on May 5th, 2014, Doris Baltimore passed away. They both died without ever finding out what happened to their son. According to his online obituary, Roy Davis died on August 30th of 2023. The obituary states, he was always there to help those in need and greeted everyone he met with a smile. Roy truly enjoyed life and was full of laughter and joy. He was a great problem solver. If you needed help solving a problem, Roy was that guy. A weird statement to write in an obituary for a man who may have made someone disappear to solve a problem. Sheriff Scott Rigglesworth said, I'm convinced Henry is somewhere between East Lansing, Michigan and Flint, Michigan. What happened to him between here and there, I don't know the answers to that. My feeling is these two guys knocking on his door do. I'm a firm believer that one of those two people was Roy. At some point, several of Henry's family members gave their DNA to create a DNA profile of Henry. The profile was entered into a national missing persons database. This allows that profile to be checked against unknown remains that may be found at some point to see if there's a match. So far, police have not found a match. We've now reached the portion of the video where we're going to share our own thoughts and opinions on this case, starting with Heather.
I really think that Roy did this because who had more motive than he did? Nobody that we know.
That's true. It makes a ton of sense for it to be Roy. You feel like there's not really too many other options in this case for who it could have been. I mean, of course, random robbery or something, but the timing would have just been very strange for that. It's also interesting reading Roy's obituary. I'm going to quote from that now. He was a great problem solver. If you needed help solving a problem, Roy was that guy. Well, this was a problem right here that needed solving, and it seems like, unfortunately, Roy was that guy. Thanks so much for watching. We'll see you next time. If you have any information about Henry's disappearance, please contact the East Lansing Police Department at 517-351-4220. There is a cash reward of at least $2,500 you will be eligible for if the information you give leads to the arrest and conviction of someone in Henry's case.